St. Marie. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in Chicago with our next guest. Juan Gonzalez is in New York.
Well, next weekend, the United States celebrates the 4th of July, the day the American colonies declared their independence from England in 1776. While many Americans will hang flags, participate in parades, and watch fireworks, Independence Day is not a cause for celebration for all. For Native Americans, it is yet another bitter reminder of colonialism, which brought fatal diseases, cultural hegemony, and full-out genocide. Neither did the new republic's promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness extend to African Americans. As our next guest notes, the white colonists who declared their freedom from the crown did not share their newly founded liberation with the millions of Africans they had captured and forced into slavery.
Professor Gerald Horne argues that the so-called Revolutionary War was actually a counter-revolution in part, not a progressive step forward for humanity, but a conservative effort by American colonialists to protect their system of slavery. For more, Professor Horne joins us here in our Chicago studio. He's the author of 2 new books, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, and another new book just out, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow. Professor Horne teaches history and African-American studies at the University of Houston. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. So as we move into this Independence Day week, what should we understand about the founding of the United States?
We should understand that July 4th, 1776, in many ways represents a counter-revolution. That is to say, that what helped to prompt July 4th, 1776 was the perception amongst European settlers on the North American mainland that London was moving rapidly towards abolition. This perception was prompted by Somerset's case, a case decided in London in June 1772, which seemed to suggest that abolition, which not only was going to be ratified in London itself, was going to cross the Atlantic and basically sweep through the mainland, thereby jeopardizing numerous fortunes, not only based upon slavery, but the slave trade. That's the short answer. The longer answer would involve going back to another revolution, that is to say the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, which among other things involved a step back for the monarch, the king, and a step forward for the rising merchant class. This led to a deregulation of the African slave trade, that is to say the Royal African Company theretofore had been in control of the slave trade, but with the rising power of the merchant class, this slave trade was deregulated, leading to what I call free trade in Africans. That is to say, merchants then descended upon the African continent, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight with the energy of demented and crazed bees, dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean and to the North American mainland. This was prompted by the fact that the profits for the slave trade were tremendous, sometimes up to 1,600 or 1,700%. And as you know, there are those even today who will sell their firstborn for such a profit. This, on the one hand, helped to boost the productive forces, both in the Caribbean and on the mainland, but it led to numerous slave revolts, not least in the Caribbean, but also on the mainland, which helped to give the mainlanders second thoughts about London's tentative steps towards abolition.
Gerald Horne, one of the things that struck me in your book is not only your main thesis that this was, in large part, a counter-revolution, the United States War of Independence, but you also link very closely what was going on in the Caribbean colonies of England as well as in the United States, not only in terms of among the slaves in both areas, but also among the white population. And in fact, you indicate that quite a few of those who ended up here in the United States fostering the American Revolution had actually been refugees from the battles between whites and slaves in the Caribbean. Could you expound on that?
It's well known that up into the middle part of the 18th century, London felt that the Caribbean colonies, Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua in particular, were in some ways more valuable than the mainland colonies. The problem was that in the Caribbean colonies, the Africans outnumbered the European settlers, sometimes at a rate of 20 to 1, which facilitated slave revolts. There were major slave revolts in Antigua, for example, in 1709 and 1736. The Maroons, that is to say the Africans who had escaped London's jurisdiction in Jamaica, had challenged the crown quite sternly. This led, as your question suggests, to many European settlers in the Caribbean making the great trek to the mainland, being chased out of the Caribbean by enraged Africans. For example, I did research for this book in Newport, Rhode Island, and the main library there to this very day is named after Abraham Redwood, who fled Antigua after the 1736 slave revolt because many of his, quote, Africans, unquote, were involved in this slave revolt. And he fled in fear and established the main library in Newport to this very day and helped to basically establish that city on the Atlantic coast. So there is a close connection between what was transpiring in the Caribbean and what was taking place on the mainland. And historians need to recognize that even though these colonies were not necessarily a unitary project, there were close and intimate connections between and amongst them.
So why this great disparity between how people in the United States talk about the creation myth of the United States, if you will? I'm not talking about indigenous people, Native American people, and this story that you have researched.
Well, it is fair to say that the United States did provide a sanctuary for Europeans. Indeed, I think part of the, quote, genius, unquote, of the U.S. project, if there was such a genius, was the fact that the founders of the United States basically called a formal truce, a formal ceasefire with regard to the religious warfare that had been bedeviling Europe for many decades and centuries. That is to say, Protestant London, so-called, versus Catholic Madrid and Catholic France. What the settlers on the North American mainland did was call a formal truce with regard to religious conflict, but then they opened a new front with regard to race. That is to say, Europeans versus non-Europeans. This at once broadened the base for the settler project. That is to say, they could draw upon those defined as white, who had roots from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains, and indeed even into the Arab world. If you look at people like Ralph Nader and Marlo Thomas, for example, whose roots are in Lebanon, but are considered to be, quote, white, unquote. This obviously expanded the population base for the settler project, and because many rights were then accorded to these newly minted whites, it obviously helped to ensure that many of them would be beholden to the country that then emerged, the United States of America, whereas those of us who were not defined as white got the short end of the stick, if you like.
And Gerald Horne, as a result of that, during the American Revolution, what was the perception or the attitude of the African slaves in the U.S. to that conflict? You talk about during the colonial times, many slaves preferred to flee to the Spanish colonies or the French colonies rather than to stay in the American colonies of England.
You are correct. The fact of the matter is that Spain had been arming Africans since the 1500s. And indeed, because Spain was arming Africans and then unleashing them on mainland colonies, particularly South Carolina, this put competitive pressure on London to act in a similar fashion. The problem there was that the mainland settlers had embarked on a project and a model of development that was inconsistent with arming Africans. Indeed, their project was involved in enslaving and manacling every African in sight. This deepens the schism between the colonies and the metropolis, that is to say London, thereby helping to foment a revolt against British rule in 1776. It's well known that more Africans fought alongside the Redcoats than fought with these settlers. And this is understandable because if you think about it for more than a nanosecond, it makes little sense for slaves to fight alongside slave masters so that slave masters could then deepen the persecution of the enslaved, and indeed, as happened after 1776, bring more Africans to the mainland, bring more Africans to Cuba, bring more Africans to Brazil for their profit.
We're talking to historian Gerald Horne. He's author of 2 new books. We're talking about the counter-revolution of 1776. The subtitle of that book is Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. And his latest book, just out, is called Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow. He's professor of history and African American studies at University of Houston. When we come back, we'll talk about that second book about Cuba. Stay with us. Slavery Days by Burning Spear. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in Chicago. Juan Gonzalez is in New York. Before we talk about the book on slavery, I want to turn to President Obama's remarks at the White House's 4th of July celebration last year. This is how President Obama described what happened in 1776.
On July 4th, 1776, a small band of patriots declared that we were a people created equal, free to think and worship and live as we please. That our destiny would not be determined for us, it would be determined by us. And it was bold, and it was brave, and it was unprecedented. It was unthinkable. At that time in human history, it was kings and princes and emperors who made decisions. But those patriots knew there was a better way of doing things, that freedom was possible, and that to achieve their freedom, they'd be willing to lay down their lives, their fortunes, their honor. And so they fought a revolution, and few would have bet on their side. But for the first time of many times to come, America proved the doubters wrong. And now, 237 years later, this improbable experiment in democracy, the United States of America, stands as the greatest nation on earth.
That was President Obama talking about the meaning of July 4th. Gerald Horne, your book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, is a direct rebuttal of this, as you called, creation myth. Could you talk about that?
Well, with all due respect to President Obama, I think that he represents, in those remarks you just cited, the consensus view. That is to say that on the one hand, there is little doubt that 1776 represented a step forward with regard to the triumph over monarchy. The problem with 1776 was that it went on to establish what I refer to as the first apartheid state. That is to say, the rights that Mr. Obama refers to were accorded to only those who were defined as white. To that degree, I argue in the book, that 1776 in many ways was analogous to unilateral declaration of independence in the country then known as Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in November 1965. UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, was in many ways an attempt to forestall decolonization. 1776, in many ways, was an attempt to forestall the abolition of slavery. That attempt succeeded until the experiment crashed and burned in 1861 with the U.S. Civil War, the bloodiest conflict to this point the United States has ever been involved in.
So, Gerald Horne, how does this story, this what you call counter-revolution, fit in with your latest book, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow?
Well, there's a certain consistency between the two books. Keep in mind that in 1762, Britain temporarily seized Cuba from Spain, and one of the regulations that Britain imposed outraged the settlers. As I argue in both books, what happened was that Britain sought to regulate the slave trade, and the settlers on the North American mainland wanted deregulation of the slave trade, thereby bringing in more Africans. What happens is that that was one of the points of contention that leads to a detonation and a revolt against British rule in 1776. I go on in the Cuba book to talk about how one of the many reasons why you have so many black people in Cuba was because of the manic energy of U.S. slave traders and slave dealers, particularly going into the Congo River Basin and dragging Africans across the Atlantic. Likewise, I had argued in a previous book on the African slave trade to Brazil that one of the many reasons why you have so many black people in Brazil, more than any place outside of Nigeria, is once again because of the manic energy of U.S. slave traders and slave dealers who go into Angola in particular and drag Africans across the Atlantic to Brazil. It seems to me that it's very difficult to reconcile the creation myth of this great leap forward for humanity when, after 1776 and the foundation of the United States of America, the United States ousts Britain from control of the African slave trade. Britain then becomes the cop on the beat trying to detain and deter U.S. slave traders and slave dealers. It seems to me that if this was a step forward for humanity, it was certainly not a step forward for Africans who, the last time I looked, comprise a significant percentage of humanity.
And Gerald Horne, so in other words, as you're explaining the involvement of of American companies in the slave trade in Brazil and Cuba, that book and also your Counter-Revolution of 1776 makes the same point that slavery was not just an issue of interest in the South to the Southern plantation owners, but that in the North, banking, insurance, merchants, shipping, were all involved in the slave trade as well.
Well, Juan, as you well know, New York City was a citadel of the African slave trade, even after the formal abolition of the U.S. role in the African slave trade in 1808. Rhode Island was also a center for the African slave trade, ditto for Massachusetts. Part of the unity between North and South was that it was in the North that the financing for the African slave trade took place, and it was in the South where you had the Africans deposited. That helps to undermine, to a degree, the very easy notion that the North was abolitionist and the South was pro-slavery.
So, Gerald Horne, what most surprised you in your research around Cuba, U.S. slavery, and Jim Crow?
Well, what most surprised me with regard to both of these projects was the restiveness, the rebelliousness of the Africans involved. It's well known that the Africans in the Caribbean were very much involved in various extermination plots, liquidation plots, seeking to abolish through force of arms and violence the institution of slavery. Unfortunately, I think that historians on the North American mainland have tended to downplay the restiveness of Africans. And I think it's done a disservice to the descendants of the population of mainland enslaved Africans. That is to say that because the restiveness of Africans in the United States has been downplayed, it leads many African Americans today to either think that their ancestors were chumps, that is to say, that they fought alongside slave owners to bring more freedom to slave owners and more persecution to themselves, or B, that they were ciphers, that is to say, they stood on the sidelines as their fate was being determined. I think that both of these books seek to disprove those very unfortunate notions.
So as we move into the Independence Day weekend next weekend, what do you say to people in the United States?
Well, I say to the people in the United States is that you have proved that you can be very critical of what you deem to be revolutionary processes. You have a number of scholars and intellectuals who make a good living by critiquing the Cuban Revolution of 1959, by critiquing the Russian Revolution of 1917, by critiquing the French Revolution of the 18th century. But yet, we get the impression that what happened in 1776 was all upside, which is rather far-fetched given what I've just laid out before you in terms of how the enslaved African population had their plight worsened by 1776, not to mention the subsequent liquidation of independent Native American polities as a result of 1776. I think that we need a more balanced presentation of the foundation of the United States of America, and I think that there's no sooner place to begin than next week with July 4th, 2014.
Well, Gerald Horne, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Historian Gerald Horne, author of 2 new books, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, as well as Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during Slavery and Jim Crow. He's a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston.